click the link and all your information is in the wrong hands, the reality of being hacked. So why did a secretive Israeli company on the leading edge of spyware programming not show up for a recent court case? And does the NSO Group think it's beyond the law? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, its products can help hack the phone of a political activist, a journalist or even a prince. The spying technology owned by the Israeli NSO Group is allegedly being used by authoritarian regimes, and within that, it's changing traditional relationships, good and bad. But it's also increasingly helping governments to crack down on whoever opposes them. NSO has faced a number of lawsuits, one of them from WhatsApp. The messaging app seems to be getting close to winning that case, if only as a function of a default ruling. The spyware manufacturer failed to show up in court in the US after it had said it would, quote, vigorously fight the allegations. A default was entered on Monday in San Francisco after WhatsApp said that its efforts to give NSO Group notice of the lawsuits all went unanswered. WhatsApp says NSO abused a flaw in its messaging app to remotely hijack hundreds of smartphones. It alleges the firm created WhatsApp accounts that were used to send malware to the mobile phones of 1,400 people, among them journalists, human rights activists, political dissidents, and diplomats. The affected users received calls from several countries, including Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Mexico. Separately, a Saudi activist accuses NSO of providing the kingdom with the spyware required to hack his phone conversations with the journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was later murdered. A New York Times report in 2018 says the UAE had asked NSO to hack into the phones of prominent figures. Amnesty International says rights activists and one of its own staff members have been targeted by NSO products. OK, let's get going. Joining us here on the programme today from Washington, D.C., we have Raphael. He's a cybersecurity correspondent for Reuters. In London, we have Tanya O'Carroll. She's the director of Amnesty Tech. And in Brussels, via Skype, we have James Shires. He's a professor at the University of Leiden who researches cybersecurity across the Middle East. Welcome to you all. Raphael, coming to you first. Is it such a surprise that NSO didn't turn up to this court date?
You know, Peter, it is and it isn't. To a certain degree, these kind of cross-jurisdictional lawsuits are always a little bit fraught, and there's often the argument that one party or the other simply doesn't have jurisdiction and doesn't have cause to file in a particular jurisdiction. So it's not particularly surprising that there is a dispute over that right now. What is a little bit surprising is that NSO hasn't made any kind of legal answer whatsoever, but is still commenting on the case publicly.
Tanya O'Carroll in London. Is it short-sighted or slightly devious and disingenuous on the part of the company not to turn up?
Well, I think this is actually in keeping with what we've seen from NSO really over the last year, as they have increased their public profile more and more, engaging with the media, clearly trying to get ahead of the criticism that they have been confronted with. Not to mention a number of lawsuits. This is just one. There's also lawsuits in Mexico and Cyprus. Cyprus and Israel, and Amnesty International bringing one of those cases in Israel. So I think it's a delaying tactic. It's consistent with what we know of them. They're a slippery company. They have said they want to put up a vigorous fight, but I suspect that vigorous fight may not be by turning up and actually answering in front of a judge and jury and confronting the evidence that's been presented to them. I suspect it will be a lot more of a tactics of discrediting, delaying, as well as looking for a way out. And of course, they've also brought a counter lawsuit in Israel against Facebook. So yes, I think this is quite what we expect and what we continue to expect from NSO.
So we're saying that, apropos of what we said in the introduction to the programme, this company does think it's above and or beyond the law because it can discredit people who are taking it to court outside the court system.
Well, the truth is, unfortunately, at the moment, they are above and beyond the law because there is absolutely no effective law really providing effective governance and oversight of the spyware industry. This is something that Amnesty International has been calling out for years now. The spyware industry has been operating in total impunity for more than a decade. And NSO is one of the most prolific and notorious actors, certainly one of the actors that's most in the media spotlight. There have been multiple cases of very clear evidence at this point, not of isolated cases of human rights activists and journalists being attacked by NSO, spyware Pegasus, but actually much more broadly, 100 human rights defenders and activists were revealed by the WhatsApp disclosure. Amnesty's own research has found over and over again, including very recently, Moroccan activists who've been targeted by NSO spyware. Our own staff members have been attacked by NSO spyware. And until there is effective laws in place that really govern the export and transfer of this kind of sophisticated and invasive technology, really, we're talking about cyber weapons here, they will continue to be able to act flagrantly, and there's no stakes for them. They can walk away. And I hope that this case from Facebook, and I think it is the first really strong case where we may actually have a chance of seeing some accountability.
James Shires in Brussels. How unusual is it for a service provider to take a third party into a legal process on the part of that service provider's users? Because that's what WhatsApp/Facebook are doing here.
This is very unusual. It's the first time we've seen any case of this kind where a targeted surveillance company is being taken to court by a large service provider or platform company. Usually, as you say, the users themselves are the main targets. This is where WhatsApp is stepping up and seems to be taking responsibility for its users. Its rhetoric around the court case says that it wants to protect the privacy of its users. So it has a large reputational effort in order to try and take this company to court to show that it is sending a message to companies that are going to exploit its services and its technology in this way.
Raphael Satter in Washington. NSO have gone public saying the Saudis allegedly trying to hack Jeff Bezos' phone wasn't the Saudis using their technology. Two quick questions. One, do you believe them? And two, if it wasn't NSO technology, who did the technology come from?
Right. Well, I mean, it's not my place to believe or not believe them. And I think it's important to note that NSO has declined to say who its clients are. There's been a lot of speculation and indeed a lot of reporting, some very serious reporting, around the use of NSO technology by the Saudis, most notably recently when a journalist from the New York Times went public to say that he had been targeted using NSO technology. So there does appear to be some use of very sophisticated spyware by the Saudi government. That said, as far as the Bezos case is concerned, I think that there are still some unanswered questions about exactly what happened there. The FTI report, which was commissioned by Jeff Bezos, has been criticized by some people as being a little bit light on technical data. And I look forward to seeing what other reporters can dig up on that particular case.
Tanya in London. Israel Israel, the NSO Group, seems to have cornered the market at this leading edge of cybersecurity. Why Israel? Why not the Americans? Why not the Russians, for example?
Well, I don't know if it's completely true that Israel is the only country that is exporting this kind of cyber surveillance technology. We actually see a number of companies, and we have been for 10 years tracking companies. There was the Italian company Hacking Team until it, was sort of busted after some leaks in 2015. There was Finfisher, which was originally a British company, Gamma International, then became a German company. There is a very, very extensive industry that has been blossoming really in the last 10 years, and I think as technology has driven prices down and this technology is more readily available for governments around the world to purchase, we're seeing, and we're going to continue to see, a proliferation and diversification of the market, not only by major players such as Israeli government, where there's a lot of investment in universities, in technology, in really being out in front in developing some of the more elite and sophisticated technologies in the industry, but increasingly homegrown stuff as well. And Amnesty Tech houses a security lab of 5 hackers and technologists who pretty much spend their full-time job is just tracking cyber attacks and campaigns targeting civil society and activists all around the world. And we found 10 campaigns in the last 2 to 3 years: Pakistan, Mexico, UAE, Egypt, really, you name it. This stuff is absolutely everywhere, and we're going to continue to see more and more of it being developed by governments and not just exported by the big governments like big countries like Israel.
James Shires in Brussels. Tanya, in her earlier answer to one of my questions, was basically saying this is an area of warfare, or we're heading towards a time perhaps when this will be an accepted area of warfare. Mm-hmm. Before we get to that point, you've studied the Middle East extensively. Is it rebalancing or redrawing relationships, virtual relationships that exist outside of the traditional relationships? Because if the Israelis are getting friendly with the Saudis, with NSO in the middle, because people are hacking other people's phones, that's perhaps they would say, a necessary positive relationship that one would never have predicted without this technology.
That's a really good point. And it's worth remembering that from the available public data, it looks like NSO doesn't have that many customers. It has around 60 customers, and around 40% of those are in the Middle East. And so the Middle East is a large market, not just for the NSO Group, but also for other spyware and targeted surveillance technologies. In terms of the regional geography and the geopolitics of targeted surveillance, although the use of these surveillance technologies is generally domestic, they're designed for internal political control, this can spread over borders, it can spread to dissidents beyond borders, and as you say, the source of this software, the ability to sell it between countries that haven't always been friends in the past, can redraw political boundaries. Not to say this is the only thing. There are other technological developments, larger signals intelligence capabilities, military capabilities, and broader geopolitical pressures that are changing these boundaries, but this is certainly playing a part.
Tanya, what are the potential consequences around a region like the Middle East? Because if you've got multiple customers working for multiple agencies, I mean, to ask the question a different way, is the use or the second handed-on use of this technology, is it licensed in any way? Is it governed in any way? Or does it just operate in the shadows all the time?
Well, technically, one of the ways that it's governed is through export licenses. So in NSO's case, it needs to apply for an export license for the Ministry of Defense in Israel, who then grant that license and allow it to export its technologies around the world. There should be a degree of due diligence that happens as part of that process. And in terms of international human rights law, there should be a human rights due diligence there in terms of really saying, is it actually appropriate to be selling this technology to X government if we know that X government has a really, really poor track record in terms of human rights and internal repression of its own citizens, and that therefore there's a high risk that the technology will end up being abused. But what we're seeing, not just in Israel, but really, as I mentioned, it's really in lots of countries that are selling this and exporting this kind of technology, many of them in Europe. It's not just spyware and malware, it's increasingly really advanced biometric systems, facial recognition systems, many of which also can have incredibly detrimental consequences when they're used or misused against their own populations. And what we're not seeing is really that there's any effective human rights due diligence in that process. So much like traditional arms, way before we managed to get things like the arms trade treaty in place, there is just a sort of wild west of companies springing up and able to sell things with very little scrutiny to really any government that they like. And the proof is in the pudding. We are seeing such extensive misuse and abuse. And therefore, clearly the due diligence and governance that is existing at the moment is absolutely failing to curtail human rights abuses, and it needs an overhaul.
OK, Raphael Satter in Washington, coming back to you. The people who work for Citizen Lab in Toronto, they on their website as of today listing several countries that use Pegasus. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody please. Pegasus is the bug that you download into your device when you click on a link when you get that message on WhatsApp. They're talking about this having a presence in Bahrain, Kazakhstan, Mexico, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. But my key point to you, Raphael Satter in Washington, is this. They also found that this tech has a footprint in 45 countries around the world. Therefore, is the technology an incubator for the military or those parts of a country's apparatus, its security apparatus, that wants to do something involving this technology before it gets military or before you say kill a Washington-based journalist when he's walked in to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul?
Right, so Citizen Lab has indeed found traces of Pegasus all over the world, and their reporting stretches back several years. There's a slight scary correction that I'd like to make to what you talked about in terms of the WhatsApp bug. Most people think of hacking as something that happens when someone sends you a link, for example, by text or by email, and then you inadvertently or out of naivete, you click on that link and then you download that piece of spyware. What was particularly frightening about the alleged WhatsApp hack attributed to NSO was that it enabled people, operators across the world, to be able to hack phones without any interaction with the target or the victim. That is to say, all you need is somebody's telephone number, and you press a button, and you hack them. No interaction needed. That's what makes all of this so intrusive and so scary. To go back to your question about the spread of NSO and who uses it, NSO says that it only sells to government agencies, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement agencies. So the fact that you have it so widespread, or the allegation that it is so widespread across the world, suggests that for this company at least, you've got a whole range of government clients across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, and indeed Latin America. So that does give you some hint of the ubiquity of this kind of spyware.
Tanya, in London, to go back to the point that you were talking about, when it comes to how this stuff is governed, NSO says, and I quote, it's harmonizing its governance structure. I'm not sure what that means, but there is something of an international disconnect here, surely, because the FBI out of the States, their official line is, we are going to take a very, very, very hard line on this. And yet, a few months back, there was a very high-profile, off-the-radar security summit/conference/sales pitch in London, hosted by the British government. NSO had a presence there. So how do you get governments to draw the balance between selling this kind of stuff and making sure that journalists, people who are interested in human rights, are kept safe?
I mean, that absolutely goes right to the heart of this, doesn't it? In the sense that the proliferation of the industry and the market for spyware like NSOs has come about precisely because there is so much demand from governments, and that includes governments like the UK government. NSO clearly have a reputation. They've been able to build up a very credible reputation among many governments, law enforcement and intelligence agencies over a few short years. The fact that Novalpina which is an investment company in London, bought the majority shares of NSO last year from its previous owner in California, is a sign. And Stephen Peel, who's on the, who owns Novalpina, is widely regarded. In fact, he used to be on the board of Global Witness, which is an environmental NGO. So he's very much sees himself as part of the great and the good. Our lengthy backwards and forwards with Novalpina about that purchase show that they really see themselves as wanting to come in and clean up the industry, clean up NSO, make sure that there's proper, effective human rights due diligence in place. NSO then published its first human rights policy, which is unprecedented in this industry to see a company publish a human rights policy. But at the moment, we're still seeing that this is all nice words, and that while they have a very clear interest in kind of stepping out of the shadows and wanting to be seen as more credible in the public eye, and they've hired a PR firm. It's a good example of that. They've been doing interviews with journalists, I think, in order to sort of clean up that image. Even the name Pegasus itself, the sort of white-winged horse, gives the idea, I think, of this sort of anodyne computer program that's doing good, fighting terrorists, fighting bad guys. But we're just not, until we actually start seeing that, this is not ending up on the phones of human rights activists, journalists, any critical voice around the world, then we can't really take them at their word, and we can't take them seriously. And at the same time, these underhand tactics The fact that the lawyers who are involved in the cases, bringing the cases in Cyprus and Israel, have been approached by undercover operatives. Now, no one knows who's behind any of that. Of course, it may be one of NSO's clients, it may be one of the governments. But there is a lot to suggest that, NSO is not doing enough. At the very least, it's being grossly negligent in terms of its obligations to human rights.
James, if we assume for a second that a lot of this will be played out as part of this legal process in San Francisco, is one of the big issues going forward WhatsApp, Facebook's interpretation of the law? Because it comes down to a thing called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And how do you apply that in a court in San Francisco to a company that's got customers around the world, that's based in the Middle East, that's got operatives in other parts of the Middle East, and does lots of business with 45 other countries?
As you say, it's complicated. The legal argument that WhatsApp is putting forward is based on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the US. There are other charges, breaching terms of service, WhatsApp's contracts, for example, but they are state-based charges, so they are secondary to this larger charge based on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The hard thing for WhatsApp to show is that it was the target of NSO's actions, and that is what legal experts seem to think is the key difference. It has to show that there was some sort of violation, some sort of illegal action taken against WhatsApp's servers or WhatsApp's code rather than against its users. And that'll be one of the key things if this case ever comes to light. But cross-jurisdictional issues, legal cases where the firms themselves are multinational firms, depends a lot on venue shopping for both the legal system they want to take the court case in and also where they are officially based.
Raphael Satter in Washington. Does some of this as well come down to the fact that multi-agencies, multiple countries have to deal with the infrastructure companies because you need to be able to cut the supply chain of that bug getting onto your device, and that's the only way to do it?
Well, in terms of the legal process, I think that what will be very interesting, if it does indeed, if NSO does indeed show up to court, which is not totally clear that it will, I think the discovery will be very interesting. On the one hand, it's going to be very unusual, in fact, unprecedented as far as I'm aware, to see the inner workings of a spyware company through a court case, through the lens of a court case like this, because there's a process called discovery in which both WhatsApp and NSO will have to produce some documentation. On the other hand, it will also be interesting from the WhatsApp point of view, because we'll see how WhatsApp deals with these kinds of spyware companies, how it protects its customers, and its users. And we don't have a great deal of insight into that. WhatsApp is a platform that's used by an extraordinary number of people across the world. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how that case plays out. As far as the infrastructure that you mentioned, the supply of bugs, that's a whole nother story. NSO and other spyware companies rely on an entire market of vulnerability vendors. These are people who find the sorts of weaknesses in programs like WhatsApp or Skype or other telecommunications programs. They find those vulnerabilities, they create tools to exploit them, and then they sell those tools on to vendors that can then package them into pieces of software that are used by companies. It's a complicated supply chain, and I think it's worthy of kind of further journalistic investigation.
Okay, it's genuinely very, very scary stuff. Raphael, Tanya, James, thank you all so much. Thank you to our guests. They were Raphael Satter, Tanya O'Carroll, and James Shires. And thank you too for your company in the last half hour. You can see the show again anytime on our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter @AJ Inside Story, or tweet me. I'm @PeterDobbie1. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I will see you very soon. For the moment, bye-bye.